What if the most lavish wedding of the entire Third Reich was celebrated just 24 hours after the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day? What if Hitler himself beamed with pride as he watched the ceremony, surrounded by Himmler, Bormann, and some of the most feared men in history, all gathered together not on a battlefield but at a reception table adorned with champagne glasses and fresh mountain flowers? And what if the groom at the center of all this pomp and ceremony would less than a year later be dragged from a Berlin apartment drunk, accused of treason, and shot by the very regime that had celebrated his wedding with such fanfare? In this video, we are going to uncover one of the strangest and most revealing social events of the entire Nazi period: the wedding of SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein to Gretel Braun, the younger sister of Hitler's own companion, Eva Braun. It is a story that weaves together ambition, vanity, political calculation, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy. It pulls back the curtain on what life looked like inside Hitler's inner circle at its most intimate, and it shows us how the glittering facade of Nazi power concealed something dark and unstable beneath. So, without further ado, let's start with the first figure on our list, the man at the very center of this story, a cavalryman who climbed higher than anyone could have predicted and fell further than almost anyone in the Reich. Hermann Otto Fegelein was born on October 30th, 1906, in the Bavarian town of Ansbach. His father, Hans Fegelein, ran a riding school, and from his earliest years, Hermann was immersed in the world of horses, discipline, and the particular masculine culture of German equestrian circles. He grew up with his younger brother, Waldemar, in a household that valued physical prowess, and Hermann proved naturally gifted with animals. He was athletic, charming, and possessed of an easy social confidence that would serve him well throughout his life. He was not, by most accounts, an intellectually exceptional student, but he had an instinctive talent for reading rooms and people, for knowing who mattered and how to make himself agreeable to them. These social gifts, as much as any military talent, would prove to be the true engine of his extraordinary ascent. Fegelein joined the Bavarian State Police in 1925 at the age of 19, but his heart was with the horses. He competed in equestrian events and quickly developed a reputation as a skilled rider. In 1929, his brother Waldemar took a significant step by joining the SS, and Hermann followed closely behind, becoming a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and the SS in 1930. This was a time when the Nazi movement was still on the rise, and joining early gave both brothers a degree of ideological seniority that would matter enormously as the party climbed to power. Hermann was assigned to the SS cavalry, where his pre-existing skills made him an immediate asset. He rose through the ranks steadily, and by 1936 he had reached the rank of SS Sturmbannführer. That same year he competed in the Summer Olympics in Berlin as part of the German equestrian team. The Games were a showcase for Nazi Germany's claims of racial and physical superiority, and Fegelein's participation gave him a public profile and a degree of prestige that extended beyond military circles. He was photogenic, athletic, and already beginning to cultivate a reputation as a man who knew how to live well. But what was the organization that Fegelein was climbing through? The SS, or Schutzstaffel, had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard unit and had grown, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, into a sprawling empire of terror, administration, and military power. The Waffen-SS, its military wing, was by the late 1930s becoming a significant fighting force that operated alongside but often independently of the regular Wehrmacht. Its cavalry units had a particular character. They retained something of the old aristocratic tradition of horseback warfare, while simultaneously embodying the most radical aspects of Nazi ideology. When war came in September 1939, these units would be unleashed in ways that revealed the true nature of the regime they served. For Fegelein, the coming war would provide the opportunity for rapid advancement, but it would also plunge him into some of the darkest chapters of the entire conflict. With the outbreak of World War II, Fegelein commanded the SS Totenkopf Reiterstandarte, the Death's Head Cavalry Regiment. The name alone tells you something about the organization's self-image and its distance from conventional military culture. Fegelein led his cavalry unit into Poland and then into the Soviet Union, following the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. It was during the operations in occupied Soviet territory that Fegelein and his men carried out some of the most horrific atrocities of the entire war. In the summer of 1941, SS cavalry units under Fegelein's command operated in the Pripyat Marshes region of what is now Belarus, a vast area of swamps, forests and small villages that the Nazi leadership had designated a zone for the most brutal anti-partisan and anti-Jewish operations. The orders given to these units were explicit. They were to kill all Jewish men, drive Jewish women and children into the swamps, and root out any partisan resistance. The massacre that Fegelein's cavalry carried out in the Pripyat marshes has been documented in chilling detail by historians. Over the course of several weeks in August and September 1941, his units killed thousands of Jewish civilians, burning villages and conducting mass shootings. One report submitted by Fegelein himself to his superiors noted matter-of-factly the numbers killed, the villages cleared, the livestock seized. These were not battlefield reports, but administrative accountings of civilian murders, written in the bureaucratic language of a man who had entirely internalized the ideology of extermination. Fegelein was awarded the Knight's Cross for his actions in these operations, and later received the Oak Leaves to this decoration as his cavalry brigade expanded and continued its operations on the Eastern Front. To the Nazi leadership, he was a decorated hero. To history, he is a war criminal. The SS Cavalry Brigade under Fegelein was expanded into the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer in 1942, and Fegelein commanded it through some of the most intense fighting on the Eastern Front. He led his troops in the massive encirclement battles that characterized the early phase of Operation Barbarossa, in anti-partisan operations across Belarus and Ukraine, and in the brutal fighting that accompanied the German advances towards Stalingrad and into the Caucasus. He was wounded in action on multiple occasions, which added to his growing reputation within SS circles as a genuine combat soldier. The Knight's Cross and its subsequent Oak Leaves were among the most coveted decorations in the German military, and Fegelein wore them with conspicuous pride. By 1943, he had achieved the rank of SS Gruppenführer und Generalleutnant der Waffen SS, a remarkably rapid rise for a man who had only entered the organization 13 years before. Yet it was not purely military achievement that drove Fegelein's ascent. Throughout this period, he had been cultivating his most important strategic relationship, not with a battlefield commander, but with Heinrich Himmler himself. Himmler, the Reichsführer SS and one of the key architects of the Holocaust, recognized in Fegelein a useful combination of military credentials, social charm, and absolute loyalty. Fegelein understood perfectly how to manage his relationship with Himmler, being deferential without being obsequious, demonstrating initiative without threatening his superior's authority. He was also, by multiple accounts, genuinely good company, witty, physically vigorous, comfortable in the elaborate social world of the Nazi elite. When Himmler needed a representative at Hitler's own headquarters, the Führerhauptquartier, Fegelein was the obvious choice. In January 1944, he was appointed as the Waffen-SS liaison officer to Hitler's personal military staff. It was this appointment that would change everything, because it placed him at the very center of power, in daily contact with Adolf Hitler himself, and, crucially, in the social world that surrounded Hitler's private life. To understand what happened next, we need to understand the unusual and often overlooked domestic life that existed around Hitler's headquarters. Despite the image of the Nazi regime as a purely military and political machine, the reality was that Hitler's inner circle had a rich and complicated social dimension. Particularly at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps near Berchtesgaden, there was a constant rotation of guests, dinners, film screenings, and informal gatherings that mixed military, political, and personal relationships in ways that profoundly influenced the exercise of power. And at the center of this social world, far more significant than her official status would suggest, was a young woman from Munich named Eva Braun. Eva Braun was born on February 6, 1912, in Munich, the second of 3 daughters born to Friedrich Braun, a schoolteacher, and his wife, Franziska. The Braun family was solidly middle-class, Catholic, and respectable, with no particular political affiliations in Eva's early years. Eva was educated by the English Sisters, a Catholic order, and by all accounts was an enthusiastic and somewhat flighty young woman, interested in fashion, sports, photography, and film. She was not intellectually ambitious, and her interests leaned heavily toward the physical and the aesthetic rather than the intellectual or political. She became an assistant and then an employee at the photographic studio of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer, in 1929 when she was 17 years old. It was through this connection that she first met Adolf Hitler, then in his early 40s and already the charismatic leader of a growing political movement. Their relationship developed slowly and was conducted with considerable secrecy. Hitler was publicly a bachelor, devoted to Germany, above romantic entanglement, and the existence of a private girlfriend would have complicated this carefully constructed image. Eva was kept away from public events, installed in comfortable apartments and eventually at the Berghof, but never acknowledged publicly as Hitler's companion. Despite this invisibility in the official record, Eva Braun exercised a real influence within the private sphere of Hitler's life. She was his companion during his leisure hours, the organizer of the domestic atmosphere at the Berghof, and particularly as the war went on and his health declined, one of the very few people with whom Hitler relaxed. She was not consulted on military or political decisions, and Hitler kept these spheres entirely separate. But within the world of the Berghof's social life, she was effectively the hostess. She organized film screenings, managed the household staff, and shaped the informal dinners and entertainments that occupied the evenings. Her position was strange, defined by absolute dependency and a peculiar invisibility in the public world, but within the closed circle of Hitler's court, she was a significant figure. Eva Braun had two sisters, older sister Ilse and younger sister Margaret, universally known as Gretel. It is Gretel who concerns us most directly, because it was she who would become Hermann Fegelein's bride. Gretel Braun was born on August 31st, 1915, making her 3 years younger than Eva and about 9 years younger than Fegelein. She had grown up in the same Munich household as Eva, sharing the same middle-class Catholic upbringing, the same interest in sport and the outdoors, and the same fondness for the good things in life. But where Eva's relationship with Hitler had given her a particular gravity, a weight that came from her intimate proximity to the centre of power, Gretel was lighter, more openly social, and rather more free in her personal life. She visited Eva at the Berghof regularly and became a familiar face in Hitler's court. She was athletic, attractive in a robust Bavarian way, and possessed of a natural sociability that made her popular among the soldiers and officials who passed through the mountain retreat. Gretel had been in and out of various romantic entanglements before her path crossed meaningfully with Fegelein's. She was known to have a taste for adventure, and was not particularly burdened by the need for conventional propriety. When Hermann Fegelein arrived at Hitler's headquarters as the Waffen-SS liaison officer in early 1944, the two began a relationship that developed with remarkable speed. Fegelein was handsome, decorated, physically impressive, and possessed of the kind of confident charm that tends to do well in social settings defined by hierarchy and performance. Gretel was attracted almost immediately. Whether Fegelein was equally captivated, or whether he recognized the extraordinary political advantages of marrying the sister of Hitler's companion, is a question that historians have debated, and the honest answer is probably that both things were true simultaneously. Fegelein was not immune to genuine attraction, but he was also a supremely calculating man who understood that a marital alliance with the Braun family was equivalent to cementing his position at the very top of the Nazi social order. Eva Braun was reportedly delighted by the developing romance. She had always been close to Gretel, and the prospect of her sister marrying into her world, of having family present in the closed and sometimes suffocating environment of Hitler's court, clearly appealed to her deeply. She encouraged the relationship and reportedly played a matchmaking role in its early stages. Hitler himself approved, and his approval was not merely social or familial. The marriage would create a direct personal connection between himself, through Eva, and one of his most important SS officers. It reinforced the personal loyalty networks that were always central to how Hitler managed power. For Himmler, whose relationship with Fegelein was that of a patron watching a protégé succeed, the match was equally advantageous. His liaison officer would now have family connections to the Führer's household. In the paranoid, claustrophobic world of Nazi court politics, this kind of personal tie was worth more than any formal appointment. Fegelein proposed to Gretel Braun sometime in the spring of 1944, and the engagement was announced with considerable celebration within the inner circle. The wedding was set for June 3, 1944, and plans were made for a ceremony befitting the social status of the participants. The location chosen was the Berghof complex in Obersalzberg, near Berchtesgaden, in the Bavarian Alps. This was Hitler's personal retreat, a place of extraordinary beauty set against the backdrop of the Alpine mountains, its buildings constructed in a grandiose but self-consciously rustic style that was meant to evoke both power and a connection to the German land. For a wedding, it was one of the most spectacular venues imaginable, and the choice underlined the degree to which this was not merely a personal celebration, but a political and social event of the first order. But what would happen to the carefully laid plans when, just 24 hours before the wedding was scheduled to take place, the entire strategic situation of the war was convulsed by the largest amphibious invasion in history? On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord, beginning the long-awaited liberation of Western Europe. The news reached Hitler's headquarters with a shock that reverberated through the entire command structure. The Allies had landed. The second front that Germany had long dreaded was now a reality. For the military commanders gathered around Hitler, the next weeks and months would be dominated by desperate attempts to contain the Allied bridgehead. And yet, the wedding of Hermann Fegelein and Gretel Braun proceeded almost exactly as planned, delayed only slightly to June 3rd, which in fact fell just before the D-Day landings rather than after. The timing is historically remarkable. The wedding took place on June 3rd, 1944, 3 days before D-Day. The world was about to change forever, and Hitler's inner circle was celebrating with champagne and flowers in the Bavarian mountains. The wedding day itself, June 3rd, 1944, was the kind of early summer day that made the Bavarian Alps seem like the most beautiful place on earth. The mountains rose green and snow-capped in the distance. The air was clear and cool, and the Berghof complex was alive with activity. The ceremony began with a civil marriage in Salzburg, conducted according to Nazi custom without religious rites, reflecting the regime's deliberate secularization of traditional institutions. The SS, under Himmler's leadership, had worked systematically to replace Christian marriage traditions, with new ceremonies rooted in Germanic paganism and National Socialist ideology, complete with rune-inscribed rings, pledges of loyalty to the race, and declarations of faith in the Führer. The Fegelein-Braun wedding followed these protocols, making it, in its ritual structure, an explicitly ideological event, even as it was being celebrated as a personal joy. After the civil ceremony in Salzburg, the celebrations moved to the Berghof itself for a reception that was, by the standards of a Germany increasingly worn down by wartime privation, extraordinarily lavish. The guest list was a roll call of the Nazi hierarchy. Adolf Hitler attended and was, by all accounts, in unusually good spirits. Photographs from the day show him smiling with evident pleasure, shaking hands with the groom, and standing in close conversation with Eva Braun, who was radiant and clearly overjoyed at having her sister marry into their world. Heinrich Himmler was present as Fegelein's patron and the head of the SS, representing the institutional sponsor of the groom. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and the gatekeeper of the Führer's access, attended as well. The Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was there. Various other SS officers, Wehrmacht generals and Nazi officials completed the company, along with family members of both the Fegelein and Braun families. The atmosphere, by all surviving accounts, was genuinely festive. Music was played, toasts were offered, and the food and drink were of a quality that stood in sharp contrast to the rations endured by ordinary Germans at the time. Eva Braun photographed the day extensively, as she photographed almost everything at the Berghof, and her pictures capture something of the curious unreality of the event. Here were the architects of one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, dancing at a wedding reception while Europe bled. And yet the joy on display seems, in the photographs, entirely genuine. These were people who had so thoroughly insulated themselves from the consequences of their actions, who lived in such a hermetically sealed world of privilege and ideology, that the dissonance between the celebrations inside and the suffering outside simply did not penetrate. The champagne flowed. Hitler raised a glass, and Gretel Braun became Gretel Fegelein. What did Fegelein's role at Hitler's headquarters actually involve? It is worth pausing here to understand the specific function he served, because it illuminates both his importance and the particular nature of his fall. As the Waffen-SS liaison officer, Fegelein was Himmler's representative at the Führer Hauptquartier, His job was to attend Hitler's daily military briefings and report back to Himmler on the content of those discussions, as well as to represent the SS perspective in the constant bureaucratic battles between different branches of the German military and police apparatus. The position required him to be present almost daily in Hitler's physical proximity, to attend the same briefings as the Wehrmacht's most senior generals, and to participate in the social life of the headquarters. He was, in effect, a spy and a courtier simultaneously, serving his patron Himmler while navigating the treacherous personal dynamics of Hitler's inner circle. Fegelein proved remarkably skilled at this role. He had the social intelligence to manage Hitler, who was notoriously difficult, prone to explosive rages, and deeply suspicious of his military commanders. Fegelein knew how to flatter without appearing obsequious, how to deliver bad news in ways that minimized the Führer's reaction, and how to position himself as always on the right side of whatever argument was currently dominating Hitler's attention. His relationship with Eva Braun, transformed by the wedding into a family connection, gave him an additional layer of protection. Eva genuinely liked Fegelein, found him amusing and lively, and occasionally interceded on his behalf when his behavior brought him close to the edge of Hitler's tolerance. This informal patronage from the Führer's companion was an invisible but real asset. Fegelein was also a notorious womanizer, and this aspect of his character deserves attention because it tells us something important about both the man and the world he inhabited. Despite his recent marriage to Gretel, Fegelein continued to pursue other women with the same aggressive confidence he brought to all aspects of his life. He was charming and physically attractive, and the combination of his decorations, his rank, and his proximity to Hitler made him enormously appealing to women who were themselves attracted to power. His affairs were conducted with limited discretion and were known to his colleagues, though apparently not in detail to either Gretel or Eva. The culture of the Nazi elite, particularly among SS officers, was not notably faithful, and men who combined military prestige with social charm operated in an environment where infidelity was widespread and often overlooked. Fegelein took full advantage of this tolerance. One affair in particular would ultimately contribute to his downfall. In the spring of 1945, as the Soviet armies were closing in on Berlin and the Third Reich was disintegrating with terrifying speed, Fegelein had been seeing a Hungarian woman whose identity remains a matter of some historical debate. This relationship, combined with other aspects of his behavior in the final weeks of the war, formed part of the background to what happened in late April 1945. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need first to understand what the months following the wedding looked like, what kind of married life Hermann and Gretel Fegelein actually lived, and how the catastrophic decline of Germany's military fortunes gradually tightened the net around everyone in Hitler's orbit. After the wedding, Gretel and Hermann settled into the rhythms of wartime life in the inner circle. Gretel divided her time between Munich, where she had family connections, and the various headquarters locations where her husband was stationed. The summer of 1944 was one of the most catastrophic periods of the entire war for Germany. As the Normandy bridgehead expanded, Soviet forces launched their massive Operation Bagration offensive that destroyed Army Group Center, and the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler nearly succeeded. The bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg at the Wolf's Lair headquarters on July 20, 1944, killed 4 people and severely wounded several others, but Hitler survived. The aftermath was a wave of arrests, executions, and paranoia that swept through the officer corps and reshaped the power dynamics of the regime's final year. Fegelein was present at the Wolf's Lair on July 20, 1944, when the bomb exploded. He survived the blast, and his loyalty to the regime in the immediate aftermath was beyond question. The SS, under Himmler, was given expanded powers to investigate and punish those involved in the plot, and Fegelein, as Himmler's liaison, participated in the communications and meetings that followed. The failed assassination attempt actually strengthened Fegelein's position temporarily, because his continued presence and evident loyalty in the aftermath reinforced his standing with Hitler. He was promoted to SS Obergruppenführer und General der Waffen SS in July 1944, one of the highest possible ranks in the SS military structure. For a man who had started as the son of a Bavarian riding instructor, this was an almost incomprehensible elevation. Meanwhile, Gretel Fegelein found herself pregnant sometime in the autumn of 1944. The timing placed the likely birth of her child in the summer of 1945, a fact that would take on a bitter and ironic dimension given what would happen to the baby's father before then. Gretel was reportedly pleased by her pregnancy, and Eva Braun was delighted at the prospect of becoming an aunt. Within the strange, sealed world of the Nazi court, the domestic joy of a coming child existed alongside the accelerating collapse of everything the regime had built. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. The Western Allies had liberated France and were advancing toward the Rhine, while Soviet forces had reached Poland and were beginning their final push toward Berlin. The optimism and momentum of the early years of conquest had given way to a grinding, desperate defensive war that everyone who examined the situation honestly knew could only end in total defeat. Hitler had retreated increasingly into his bunker, both literally and figuratively. In January 1945, he moved permanently to the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, and those in his immediate circle were expected to follow. The atmosphere in the bunker was one of mounting unreality, with Hitler issuing orders to armies that barely existed, planning counteroffensives with forces that existed only on maps, and alternating between moments of extraordinary calm and explosive, terrifying rages. Eva Braun had joined him in the bunker, demonstrating a loyalty that many of those around her found genuinely difficult to comprehend. She had travelled to Berlin knowing that she might never leave, choosing to die beside the man she loved over surviving in the comfortable obscurity of Munich or Berchtesgaden. Gretel Fegelein, however, made a different choice. She was pregnant and in the later stages of her term by early 1945, and she elected to remain in Bavaria, rather than follow her husband and sister into the bunker. This decision, made for entirely understandable reasons related to her pregnancy, meant that she was not present for the final catastrophe that unfolded in Berlin in late April 1945. It meant that she survived, and it created the tragic situation in which she would give birth to her daughter without knowing exactly how her husband had met his end, and without him ever having seen his child. What was Fegelein doing in these final months? His role as SS liaison at the Führer bunker continued, but the nature of his work had changed entirely. There were no longer proper military briefings to attend in any meaningful sense, no strategic decisions to transmit, no coherent policy to communicate. Instead, the daily meetings in the bunker had become increasingly surreal performances in which Hitler directed phantom armies, raged at imaginary enemies, and alternated between messianic conviction that Germany would be saved by some miracle and a cold acceptance that the end was near. Fegelein attended these meetings, maintained his outward composure, and continued to send reports to Himmler, but anyone present could see that the situation was hopeless. Himmler himself had begun to explore the possibility of a negotiated surrender without Hitler's knowledge, an act of extraordinary treachery from the man who had been the most loyal servant of the regime. Fegelein was aware of Himmler's secret contacts through his role as liaison, though the precise extent of his knowledge and involvement in these negotiations is disputed by historians. What is clear is that as April 1945 drew on, Fegelein's own behaviour became increasingly erratic and self-seeking. He had begun to behave like a man who was already mentally disconnecting from the sinking ship, even while he remained physically present on it. The final crisis came with startling speed. On April 27, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting literally in the streets of Berlin, with the Reich Chancellery under intermittent artillery fire, it was discovered that SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein was missing from the Führer bunker. He had simply left. Officers sent to locate him found him in his apartment in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin, drunk, dressed in civilian clothes, apparently preparing to flee the city. With him was a woman, not Gretel, but a Hungarian woman with whom he had been conducting an affair. When the SS officers who had been sent to retrieve him arrived, Fegelein was in a state that could charitably be described as disorder. He had packed civilian bags and appeared to have been planning to disappear into the chaos of a collapsing city. He was arrested and brought back to the bunker. Initially, Hitler's rage was focused primarily on Himmler rather than Fegelein. News had reached the bunker that Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the man who had built the entire apparatus of terror that sustained the regime, had been conducting secret peace negotiations with the Western Allies through the Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte. Hitler's response to this news was an explosion of near-incoherent fury. He declared Himmler a traitor, stripped him of all his offices, and ordered his arrest. In this context, Fegelein's disappearance from the bunker was reinterpreted not merely as desertion, but as potentially connected to Himmler's treachery. The fact that Fegelein had been Himmler's personal representative made him, in Hitler's increasingly paranoid mind, guilty by association. Eva Braun attempted to intercede on her brother-in-law's behalf. This was a genuinely courageous act given the atmosphere in the bunker at that moment, and it reflected both her personal affection for Fegelein and her concern for her pregnant sister. She appealed to Hitler to spare him, pointing out that Gretel was carrying his child. Hitler's response was not reassuring. He was capable of compartmentalizing his personal affections from his rage in ways that could seem almost inhuman, and the combination of perceived treachery, the Himmler connection, and the general atmosphere of apocalyptic fury that pervaded the bunker in those final days made him implacable. Eva's intercession did not save Fegelein, though it may have delayed the final decision for a few hours. An impromptu court-martial was convened in the bunker. Fegelein was examined and the evidence against him was considered. He was stripped of all his ranks and decorations, a formal process that, in the twisted legal theatre of the Nazi system, preceded execution. He was demoted to the lowest possible status. The decorations that had been so central to his identity, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves that he had worn with such pride, were removed. The verdict of the court-martial was death. On April 29, 1945, less than 48 hours before Hitler himself would commit suicide, Hermann Otto Fegelein was led out into the Reich Chancellery garden and shot by an SS firing squad. He was 38 years old, the man who had danced at his own wedding in the Bavarian mountains less than a year before, surrounded by the most powerful figures in the Nazi state, toasted by Hitler himself, ended his life against a wall in a besieged city, shot by the regime he had served. The exact circumstances of his execution, like much of what happened in the bunker in those final days, are somewhat difficult to verify because so few witnesses survived to give coherent accounts. Some historians have suggested that Fegelein was already so incapacitated by drink when taken from his apartment that he may barely have understood what was happening to him in his final hours. Others argue that he was more calculating than this picture suggests, that his attempted flight was a conscious decision made with at least partial awareness of Himmler's negotiations, and that he understood very well the danger he was in when he was brought back to the bunker. The truth is, probably somewhere between these portraits, a man who had always operated on instinct and charm, who had risen through talent and luck and ruthlessness, and who, when confronted with the definitive end of the world he had inhabited, simply found that those qualities were no longer sufficient. For Gretel Braun, hundreds of kilometers away in Bavaria, the news of her husband's execution came as a devastating blow. She had known that the war was ending catastrophically, that Berlin was being destroyed, that her sister Eva was in the bunker with Hitler and might not survive. But the specific fate of Hermann, the manner of his death, the circumstances, all of this took time to become clear. On May 5, 1945, 6 days after Fegelein's execution and 4 days after Hitler and Eva Braun had committed suicide in the bunker, Gretel Fegelein gave birth to a daughter. She named the girl Eva Barbara Fegelein, giving her the name of her dead sister as a first name, an act of mourning and commemoration that tells us something about the depth of the bond between the two women. Eva Braun had died on April 30, 1945, by cyanide poisoning in the Führer bunker, on the day of her marriage to Hitler, having chosen to die with the man she had devoted her life to. Gretel learned of her sister's death and her husband's execution within days of each other, while simultaneously bringing new life into a world that had just been utterly destroyed. The baby, Eva Barbara, was born into a Germany that was surrendering, a continent in ruins, a world that was just beginning to comprehend the full scale of the crimes that had been committed by the regime that had surrounded her parents. She was the daughter of a convicted war criminal and a decorated SS officer who had been executed for desertion, and the niece of Adolf Hitler's companion. The weight of this inheritance was extraordinary, and it would shape her entire life. Eva Barbara grew up in West Germany during the post-war decades, raised by Gretel with the usual combination of protective silence and unavoidable knowledge that characterized the experience of children of the Nazi elite in that period. What happened to Gretel Fegelein in the years after the war? She faced the denazification process that swept through occupied Germany, and she was subjected to investigation and internment by Allied authorities. Her connection to Eva Braun, and thus to Hitler himself, combined with her marriage to Fegelein and her own life within the Nazi court, made her a person of significant interest to Allied intelligence officers. However, Gretel was ultimately not in possession of great strategic information. She had not been involved in military or political decisions. Her knowledge was of the domestic and personal world of the Nazi elite, and while this was historically valuable, it did not constitute the kind of evidence that led to prosecution. She was processed through the denazification system, classified and eventually released. Gretel Fegelein lived for many years after the war, raising her daughter Eva Barbara in the new Federal Republic of Germany. She rarely spoke publicly about her experiences, the wedding, her husband, her sister, or the extraordinary world she had inhabited. This silence was characteristic of many survivors of the Nazi inner circle, who often retreated into studied obscurity after 1945, choosing the protective anonymity of a nation that collectively preferred, at least in the immediate post-war decades, to look forward rather than backward. She remarried at some point, taking a new surname, and made determined efforts to live a private life. Her daughter Eva Barbara equally preferred to stay outside the public eye, and unlike some of the children of Nazi figures, she did not become a prominent public figure, either defending or denouncing her father's legacy. Gretel Fegelein died in 1987, having lived long enough to see the historical reckoning with the Nazi era become genuinely comprehensive, to see the documents and testimonies accumulate, the trials and investigations multiply, and the historical judgment on the world she had inhabited as a young woman become definitive. She died having outlived her sister by 42 years, having outlived her husband by 42 years, and having spent most of her adult life in the shadow of a few months in 1944 and 1945 that had been more dramatic than almost any period in modern history. It is worth pausing at this point to consider the other figures who attended that wedding in June 1944, the guests who raised their glasses to the health of Hermann and Gretel Fegelein on that bright summer day in the Bavarian mountains, because their subsequent fates illuminate the broader story of the regime's collapse and its aftermath. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS who had served as Fegelein's patron and attended the wedding as one of its most prestigious guests, met an end that was in its own way as ignominious as Fegelein's. After his betrayal of Hitler through the secret peace negotiations, he had fled Berlin and attempted to disappear. He was captured by British forces on May 22, 1945, travelling under a false identity. Before he could be brought to trial, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died within minutes of capture. The man who had overseen the murder of millions died in a British military compound. His death a brief, final act of defiance that denied justice its proper form. He was 54 years old. Martin Bormann, another wedding guest and Hitler's secretary, who had wielded extraordinary power through his control of access to the Führer, attempted to escape from the Berlin bunker in the final hours. His fate was uncertain for decades afterward, with various theories circulating about whether he had escaped to South America or died in the attempt. The mystery was eventually resolved when skeletal remains found in Berlin in 1972 were identified as Bormann's, later confirmed by DNA analysis. In 1998, he had died during the attempt to escape Berlin, either killed by fire or by suicide. He was the only major war criminal to be tried in absentia at Nuremberg, where he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Reich foreign minister who attended the wedding, was captured by British forces in June 1945. He was tried at the Nuremberg trials, where he was found guilty on all 4 counts against him: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was hanged at Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946, the first of the condemned men to be executed that morning. His last words were a hope for peace between West and East, an almost absurd statement from a man who had done so much to shatter the peace of Europe. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, another figure present in the orbit of the wedding celebrations, was similarly tried at Nuremberg for his role in planning and executing the wars of aggression, for issuing the Commando Order and the Commissar Order, and for his general role as Hitler's most compliant military servant. As the source material for this video notes, unlike most defendants, Keitel accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledging that he was responsible for all outcomes resulting from his signed orders. This unusual candor did not save him. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and hanged at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946, the same morning as Ribbentrop. Alfred Jodl, who served as the chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht and was another figure whose path intersected with the wedding world, was likewise tried at Nuremberg. He stood accused of schemes to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, particularly his endorsement of the Commando Order and the Commissar Order. He attempted to defend himself as a professional soldier following orders, but the tribunal rejected this defence. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and hanged on October 16, 1946. His final words were a salute to Germany, spoken with the rigid formality of a man who had served the state without moral reservation his entire career. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the German Navy throughout the war and who had attended various events in the Nazi inner circle during the same period, was tried at Nuremberg for conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was acquitted of the crimes against humanity charge but found guilty of the other 2 and sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison. He served his full sentence and was released in 1956, after which he retired to a small town near Hamburg and wrote his memoirs. He died in 1980 at the age of 89, one of the longest-lived of the senior Nazi military figures. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe commander and one of the most powerful figures in the entire Nazi state, was not at the Fegelein wedding, but he was intimately connected to the social world it represented. His wife Emmy had been a prominent figure at the Berghof and in Nazi court society. His daughter Edda had been born into the same privileged circle, and his presence or absence from any event was itself a political signal. Göring was captured at the end of the war, tried at Nuremberg, and found guilty on all 4 counts. He was sentenced to death but cheated the executioner by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule on the night before his scheduled hanging. He died on October 15, 1946, leaving behind his wife Emmy and daughter Edda to navigate the ruins of his legacy. Let us return now to the wedding itself and try to understand it in its full historical context. What does the Fegelein wedding tell us about the nature of the Nazi regime? On one level, it is simply a story about vanity, ambition, and the human capacity for celebration in the midst of catastrophe. The people who attended that wedding in June 1944 were not oblivious to the military situation. They were not simple-minded optimists who genuinely believed Germany would win. Many of them, Fegelein certainly, would have known that the war's outcome was deeply uncertain, and some would have known privately that it was lost. And yet they drank champagne and danced because that is what human beings do, because the celebrations of life, of marriage and love and community persist even in the darkest of circumstances. But there is something else going on here that is far less sympathetic. The lavishness of the wedding, its ostentatious opulence at a moment when ordinary Germans were suffering the privations of total war, when the occupied populations of Europe were enduring starvation and terror and systematic murder, speaks to a quality of moral insulation that was characteristic of the Nazi elite at their worst. These were people who had become so thoroughly the beneficiaries of a system of organized violence and theft that they no longer noticed the contradiction between their pleasure and the suffering that made it possible. The estates confiscated from Jewish families, the slave labour that kept their households functioning, the looted art that decorated their walls, the systematic murder that secured their dominance, all of this had receded into the background of their daily lives, normalised by repetition and ideology into something unremarkable. The wedding was also a performance of power, a ritual that reinforced the social hierarchy of the regime and demonstrated who belonged to the innermost circle and who did not. Hitler's presence was not simply a personal gesture of warmth toward his companion's sister. It was a signal. This man, Fegelein, has the Führer's favour. This woman, Gretel, is under the protection of the most powerful figure in Germany. The guests who attended understood perfectly that they were participating in an act of political theatre as much as a personal celebration, and their presence itself was an acknowledgement of Fegelein's status and a reinforcement of their own place in the hierarchy. There is also the question of what the wedding meant for Eva Braun. Her photographs of the day are among the most vivid records we have of the event, and they capture something of the genuine happiness she felt. For Eva, who had spent years in a relationship defined by invisibility and exclusion, who had attempted suicide twice in the early years of her relationship with Hitler when his indifference became unbearable, who had been kept from public acknowledgement and treated as a secret, the wedding offered something rare, a moment when she could be openly, publicly present, when her family and her world were together. She was the sister of the bride, the companion of the most powerful man in Germany, and she was photographing everything with the enthusiasm of a woman who genuinely loved these people and this moment. The tragedy of that happiness, knowing what we know about how all of it would end less than a year later, is one of the most haunting aspects of the entire story. What about the broader social context of the wedding? It is important to understand that this was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern of social life within the Nazi elite that historians have increasingly examined in recent years. The world of the Berghof, of Hitler's various headquarters, of the social events organized by Eva Braun and the wives of senior officials constituted a kind of parallel universe, a protected bubble of privilege and performance that existed alongside and in many ways depended upon the machinery of mass murder. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, wrote in his memoirs about the strange atmosphere of the Berghof, about the long evenings of cinema and conversation, about Hitler's domesticity and his fondness for the people around him. Speer presented this domestic world as evidence of Hitler's humanity, but the more significant truth is that this human warmth and this extraordinary criminality coexisted without tension in the same person and the same environment. The wives of Nazi leaders who attended the Fegelein wedding or moved in similar circles represent another dimension of this story. Emmy Goering, who self-importantly called herself the First Lady of the Third Reich, had accumulated vast wealth through her husband's plundering of occupied Europe. Margaret Himmler, wife of the Reichsführer SS, had recorded her observations of occupied Poland in her diary with a casual racism that revealed how thoroughly the ideology had penetrated even the domestic sphere. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, remained a devoted National Socialist until her death in 1995. These women were not passive bystanders to the regime their husbands served. They were participants, beneficiaries, and in many cases, active supporters. Gretel Fegelein, by marrying into this world, was joining a social structure that was inextricably bound up with the worst crimes of the 20th century. Let us consider more carefully the figure of Fegelein himself, because his character illuminates something important about the kind of person who thrived in the Nazi system. He was not, by most historical accounts, a true ideological fanatic in the manner of Himmler or Goebbels. He did not appear to be motivated primarily by a burning belief in National Socialist racial theory or by a messianic vision of German destiny. He was rather an opportunist, a man of exceptional social gifts and limited moral imagination who had found in the Nazi movement a structure that rewarded his particular combination of talents. The SS, with its emphasis on physical toughness, loyalty to superiors, and willingness to carry out extreme violence, suited him perfectly. He was good at violence, good at charm, good at working within hierarchies, and sufficiently ruthless to do whatever was required of him without apparent internal conflict. This type, the opportunist careerist rather than the ideological true believer, was in many ways more central to the functioning of the Nazi regime than the fanatics. It was men like Fegelein, competent, ambitious, socially skilled and morally flexible, who actually ran the day-to-day operations of a regime that depended on the willing participation of hundreds of thousands of people. The fanatics set the direction and provided the energy, but the machinery required people who would implement the most extreme orders without the need for constant ideological reinforcement. People for whom participation in mass murder was, at some level, simply a job requirement that they accepted in exchange for the rewards the system offered. Fegelein's decorations, his rank, his position at Hitler's headquarters, his marriage into the Braun family, all of these were the rewards that the system offered for the work it required of him. He took the rewards and did the work, and the moral weight of that work appears not to have troubled him at all. His ultimate betrayal, the drunken flight from the bunker in the final days, can be read in two ways. One reading is sympathetic. Even Fegelein, even this man who had committed himself so completely to the regime, had at the last moment chosen self-preservation over the nihilistic loyalty that the bunker demanded in its final days. He had tried to save himself. The other reading is less sympathetic. He simply remained, to the end, the same opportunist he had always been. When the regime was riding high, he had served it with complete fidelity because that was what served his interest. When it was collapsing, he tried to slip away because his interest now lay elsewhere. There was no moral awakening, no moment of recognition, just the same calculation operating in changed circumstances. The child he left behind, little Ava Barbara, represents perhaps the most poignant element of the entire story. Born into a world that had just been destroyed, named after an aunt who had chosen death over survival, fathered by a man executed as a traitor by the regime he had served, she entered life carrying a burden that she had done absolutely nothing to deserve. The children of Nazi leaders faced a particular form of this burden, as historians and journalists have documented extensively in the decades since the war. Some, like Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who served as Governor-General of occupied Poland, chose to confront their inheritance directly, writing books that denounced their fathers and worked to ensure that the truth was not forgotten. Others retreated into silence, changed their names and constructed lives at maximum distance from the past. Eva Barbara Fegelein chose the path of silence, and given the specific circumstances of her parents' lives and deaths, this choice is difficult to judge harshly. The question posed by this video's title, Nazi Fairytale or Nazi Nightmare, deserves a direct answer. The wedding of Hermann Fegelein and Gretel Braun on June 3, 1944, was both simultaneously. As a spectacle, it had the elements of a fairy tale: the beautiful mountain setting, the lavish celebration, the young bride and her decorated groom, the powerful guests, the flowers and champagne and music. Eva Braun's photographs show a moment that looks, in isolation, like pure joy. But the fairy tale was built on a foundation of blood and theft and murder, presided over by men who between them were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. And the nightmare was already unfolding around them, in the beaches of Normandy, in the forests of Belarus, where Fegelein had supervised massacres 3 years before, in the concentration camps that were still operating and killing while the champagne was being poured. The transition from fairy tale to nightmare was swift and complete. Less than a year after the wedding, the groom was dead, shot in a Berlin garden by the regime he had served. The bride was a widow giving birth to a fatherless child. The host of the party was dead by his own hand in a bunker. The guests were dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. The world they had celebrated that day in the Bavarian mountains had ceased to exist, and in its place was a Germany of ruins and shame, beginning the long and difficult process of reckoning with what it had done and who it had been. The Fegelein wedding stands in history as a kind of snapshot, a moment frozen in time that captures the particular horror of the Nazi system in its combination of the recognizably human and the utterly monstrous. The people at that wedding were not, in their private moments, simply monsters. They loved their families, appreciated beauty, enjoyed music and food and celebration. And they had organized and participated in the systematic murder of millions of people. The coexistence of these two realities, their absolute refusal to cancel each other out, is what makes the history of the Nazi regime so persistently disturbing and so important to understand. Historians have sometimes struggled with how to write about the private and social lives of the Nazi elite without either humanizing them inappropriately or reducing them to simple caricatures of evil. The Fegelein wedding presents this challenge in concentrated form. To describe it accurately, we have to acknowledge that it was a real wedding, with real human emotions: joy, love, family connection, celebration, and we have to hold that acknowledgement alongside the full knowledge of what the people at that wedding had done and would continue to do. The failure to hold both truths simultaneously, the retreat into either simple vilification or dangerous humanization, produces a distorted understanding of how mass atrocity actually happens. Because the truth, the genuinely terrifying truth, is that mass atrocity is not committed by monsters who experience nothing of ordinary human feeling. It is committed by people who have learned, through ideology and habituation and the mechanics of bureaucratic violence, to partition off one part of their experience from another, to keep the celebration and the murder in separate compartments that never quite touch. Hermann Fegelein was happy at his wedding. He was also a man who had supervised the killing of thousands of Jewish civilians in the Pripyat marshes. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. There is one more aspect of this story that deserves extended consideration: the role of romantic love and personal loyalty in the Nazi inner circle, and what it meant for the women who were connected to these men. Eva Braun's decision to remain in the bunker with Hitler, to die beside him rather than escape to safety, has been the subject of sustained historical discussion. It can be read as a tragic testament to love, as evidence of how completely dependent she had become on a relationship that defined her entire adult life, or as a final act of ideological commitment by a woman who genuinely believed in the cause. The truth is probably some combination of all three. Gretel's choice to remain in Bavaria rather than follow her sister and husband to the bunker can equally be read multiple ways: as prudence, as self-preservation, as a recognition that her pregnancy gave her different responsibilities, or simply as the result of circumstances that had not quite brought her to the point of sharing her sister's fatal loyalty. The contrast between the two sisters in their final decisions, one choosing death out of love and loyalty, the other surviving, having a child, rebuilding a life, is one of the most humanly compelling elements of the entire story. They had grown up in the same house, shared the same middle-class Catholic Bavarian upbringing, and ended up in entirely different relationships to the catastrophe that swept over them. Eva Braun was defined in the end by her relationship with Hitler. She died because of it, and is remembered almost entirely in terms of it. Gretel Fegelein survived and was defined, in the long subsequent decades of her life, by her relationship to that year of extraordinary events, by the wedding photographs and the baby and the dead husband and the dead sister. As a final reflection, it is worth noting that the physical traces of the world in which the Fegelein wedding took place have largely disappeared. The Berghof itself was partially destroyed by Allied bombing in April 1945 and then deliberately demolished by the West German authorities in 1952 as part of a conscious effort to prevent it from becoming a place of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. The Führerbunker in Berlin was similarly demolished after the war, and the site was built over. The physical landscape of Nazi power, the spectacular mountain retreats and underground command centres and grand architectural fantasies was systematically erased as part of Germany's attempt to begin again. What remains are the photographs, the documents, the testimonies, the graves of the murdered, and the ongoing work of historians trying to understand how it all happened. The wedding photographs taken by Eva Braun have survived and are held in archives. They occasionally surface in historical documentaries and books about the Nazi period. They show what they show: a wedding, a happy occasion, a moment of celebration in a world that was about to end. They do not show the Pripyat marshes. They do not show Auschwitz. They do not show the faces of the victims whose deaths made the champagne possible. They are a record of one kind of truth, and history requires us to hold them alongside the other kind simultaneously, never letting either one eclipse the other. Hermann Fegelein lived 38 years, rose from the son of a riding instructor to one of the highest ranks in the SS, committed war crimes that cost thousands of innocent lives, married into Hitler's family circle at a lavish ceremony attended by the most powerful men in Germany, served as the most dangerous regime in modern history's liaison at its nerve centre, and died drunk and stripped of his decorations in a besieged garden in Berlin, shot by the men who had toasted his health less than a year before. His life was, in its way, a concentrated history of the Third Reich. The rapid rise, the extraordinary violence, the social display, the ultimate self-destruction. His wedding was the high point, the moment of maximum glitter and connection and official favour, suspended improbably between the catastrophes that preceded and followed it. Gretel Braun Fegelein lived until 1987 and raised her daughter in silence. Eva Braun died on April 30th, 1945, aged 33, beside the man she loved in a bunker in a burning city. Their father, Friedrich Braun, survived the war and lived until 1964. Their older sister, Ilse, who had kept more distance from the inner circle than either of her sisters, survived until 1979. The family, the ordinary Bavarian family from which the whole extraordinary story grew, dispersed and faded, leaving behind the photographs and the history and the unanswerable questions. Was it a fairy tale? Yes, for a few hours on a June day in 1944, in the way that all weddings are fairy tales, brief pauses in the otherwise unrelenting difficulty of being alive. Moments when we insist that joy is possible and love is real and beauty matters. Was it a nightmare? Yes, because of what surrounded it, what made it possible, what it was embedded in, and what came after. The Fegelein wedding was both at once, and that is exactly what makes it so important to remember and so difficult to look at directly. It asks us to see clearly, to hold complexity without retreating into either comfortable simplicity or numbing abstraction. It was a Nazi fairy tale. It was a Nazi nightmare. It was, above all, a human story in an inhuman time. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed learning about the private world of Hitler's inner circle, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II. There you will find the full stories of Emmy Goering, Margaret Himmler, Lena Heydrich, and Ilse Hess, remarkable and disturbing accounts of women who lived in the shadow of some of history's greatest criminals and navigated their post-war lives in very different ways. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. To truly understand the Fegelein wedding, we must go deeper into the world that produced it, the elaborate and often grotesque social machinery of the Nazi inner circle, and trace how each thread of that world connected to the ceremony on June 3rd, 1944. Let us begin by revisiting the man himself more thoroughly, because Hermann Fegelein's wartime career in the East deserves closer examination than most popular histories of the Nazi period have given it. The Pripyat Marshes operation of August 1941, which we mentioned earlier, was one of the first large-scale massacres carried out by SS cavalry units after the launch of Operation Barbarossa. To understand the scale of what was done, we need to understand the geography. The Pripyat Marshes, also known as the Rokitno Marshes or the Polesi, form one of the largest wetland ecosystems in Europe, a vast expanse of swamp, forest and river delta straddling what is now the border between Belarus and Ukraine. In 1941, this region was home to a mixed population of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, and a large Jewish community who had lived in the towns and villages of the marshes for centuries. The Jewish communities of this region, many of them Yiddish-speaking and deeply rooted in Ashkenazi tradition, were among the oldest in Eastern Europe. When the SS cavalry arrived in the summer of 1941, they came with explicit orders. Higher SS and police leader Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who commanded anti-partisan operations across the region, had issued directives that were barely coded in their intent. The Jewish population was to be eliminated, partisans were to be shot, and the countryside was to be pacified in ways that left no ambiguity about what pacification meant. Fegelein's 1st SS Cavalry Brigade was one of the principal instruments of this policy. The operations report that Fegelein submitted to his superiors at the end of August 1941, which has survived in the historical archives, is a document that demands to be read carefully by anyone who wants to understand the man who would waltz at his own wedding 3 years later. It notes, in the flat bureaucratic language of Nazi administrative culture, the number of Jews shot, the number of villages cleared, the number of weapons and animals seized. The numbers are in the thousands. The language is that of an inventory, not a moral reckoning. Fegelein received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in October 1941, specifically in recognition of his leadership during these operations. When the recommendation for this decoration was written, it cited his commandability, his energy, and his effectiveness in carrying out his assigned tasks. His assigned tasks had included mass murder. The decoration was the Third Reich's way of saying, "This is the kind of soldier we want. This is who we honor." The Knight's Cross was one of Germany's most prestigious military decorations, and receiving it put Fegelein in a company that included many of the most celebrated military figures of the war. He wore it with evident pride, and photographs from the Berghof and the wedding itself show it prominently displayed at his throat. By the spring of 1942, Fegelein's brigade had been expanded into a full division, the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, and his personal promotion to SS Brigade Führer followed. The naming of the division after Florian Geyer, a 16th century German knight who led a peasant uprising during the German Peasants' War, was characteristic of the SS's appropriation of German historical imagery for ideological purposes. Himmler had a particular obsession with Germanic history and mythology, and the names given to SS divisions often reflected his attempts to connect his organization to a romanticized vision of German martial tradition. Fegelein, as a cavalry commander, fitted neatly into this romantic self-image, even as the reality of what his unit was doing bore no relationship whatsoever to the chivalric mythology being invoked. The Florian Geyer Division continued its operations on the Eastern Front through 1942 and into 1943, participating in the massive battles that followed the German defeat at Stalingrad. By this period, Fegelein had been wounded multiple times and had demonstrated a genuine physical courage in combat that was distinct from his social calculations. Whatever else might be said about him, he was not a coward, at least not until the final extremity of April 1945. He was decorated again, and his promotions continued, bringing him by late 1943 to the rank of SS Gruppenführer und Generalleutnant der Waffen-SS. He was 37 years old, and he had risen from a Bavarian cavalry enthusiast to one of the most senior officers in the Waffen-SS. This trajectory tells us something important about the SS as an institution. It was one that rewarded a particular combination of ideological reliability, physical toughness, and social intelligence, with a rapidity of promotion that the more tradition-bound Wehrmacht could not match. It was during this period that Himmler made the decision to appoint Fegelein as his liaison at the Führerhauptquartier. The decision was not arbitrary. Himmler needed someone at Hitler's headquarters who was trusted, articulate, socially skilled, and absolutely loyal to him. Personally, he needed someone who could navigate the complex and often treacherous personal dynamics of the Führer's court, where generals competed for Hitler's favour and grudges could end careers. Fegelein had demonstrated all of these qualities, and his genuine combat experience gave him a credibility with Hitler that a purely administrative officer would have lacked. Hitler respected soldiers, particularly decorated ones, and Fegelein's chest full of decorations made him someone the Führer took seriously from the start. Fegelein arrived at Hitler's headquarters in January 1944, and within weeks he had made himself indispensable. He attended the twice-daily military briefings, took careful notes on the discussions and decisions, and transmitted these to Himmler in regular reports. He also made himself personally agreeable to Hitler, who found in him a welcome contrast to the often ponderous formality of the Wehrmacht generals. Fegelein could be funny when funny was needed, respectful when respect was required, and physically present in the way that the Führer valued, ready to appear at any hour, always attentive, never showing the exhaustion or despair that was beginning to hollow out many of those around Hitler. He was, in short, very good at his job, and the job required him to be a combination of intelligence officer, courtier, and companion. The social world he entered was dominated by the women around Hitler, and Eva Braun occupied a position within it that was simultaneously powerful and precarious. We have already described her background and her relationship with Hitler, but it is worth understanding more concretely what her daily life looked like in the Berghof environment that was the backdrop to the Fegelein courtship and wedding. Eva Braun's days at the Berghof followed a rhythm that was largely of her own creating. She rose late, exercised vigorously, she was an accomplished skier and gymnast, and spent much of the afternoon photographing, or filming the garden, the mountains, and the people around her. She had a passion for photography that went beyond the merely documentary. She had a genuine aesthetic sense and took considerable care with her compositions. The home movies she made at the Berghof are now an invaluable historical record, capturing moments of domestic ordinariness in a place associated primarily with mass murder and historical catastrophe. Her evenings were organised around Hitler's own routine. He was a notorious night owl who preferred to conduct business in the late afternoon and early evening, and then retire to the large common room at the Berghof for informal gatherings that lasted well past midnight. These gatherings were ritualised and in some ways oppressive. Hitler dominated the conversation, repeating the same stories and opinions that he had been repeating for years, and social convention required that his guests respond with interest and admiration regardless of how many times they had heard the same anecdote. Eva Braun sat in her allotted place, participated in the conversation at the level that was expected of her, and then when Hitler retired would sometimes stay up with his adjutants and her own friends for more genuinely relaxed conversation. She smoked heavily when Hitler was not present, since he disapproved of smoking, and she concealed the habit from him. She drank modestly. She enjoyed dancing and music. She watched films with Hitler most evenings. He particularly favoured American films, often watched in German dubbed versions, as well as operettas and light entertainments. Into this world came Fegelein in January 1944, and within it came Gretel Braun, who was a regular visitor. Their relationship developed in the hothouse atmosphere of the Berghof social world, where proximity was constant, entertainment was organised, and the presence of powerful men added a particular charge to every social interaction. Gretel Braun was, by all accounts, charming in an uncomplicated way that contrasted with Eva's more complex position. She was young, athletic, spirited, and unencumbered by the weight of Eva's relationship with Hitler. She could simply enjoy the party, flirt with the interesting new arrival, and respond to Fegelein's considerable personal magnetism without the calculations and constraints that governed her sister's behaviour. Fegelein, for his part, would have understood immediately who Gretel was and what a connection with her represented. He was not a man who acted without calculation, and the calculation here was crystal clear. To marry Gretel Braun was to become, formally and permanently, part of Hitler's family circle. It was to transform a professional connection, one that depended on Himmler's continued favour and Hitler's continued regard, into a personal one that had the additional stability of family loyalty. Nazi political culture placed enormous weight on personal loyalty and family connection, and a man who was Eva Braun's brother-in-law occupied a position of significant informal protection. Even if Himmler fell from favour, even if some military reversal created enemies for Fegelein in the Wehrmacht, the family connection to the Führer's companion would remain. It was an insurance policy written in gold, and Fegelein recognised it as such. But we should not be entirely cynical. The evidence suggests that Fegelein did find Gretel genuinely attractive, and that the feelings between them were real, at least initially. The rapidity of the engagement, the warmth with which Gretel spoke of Hermann in her letters from this period, the photographs from the wedding that show the couple in genuinely affectionate proximity, all of these suggest something more than pure calculation on at least her side, and probably on his as well. The Nazi world was not immune to ordinary human emotion, however much its ideology attempted to subsume personal feeling into the collective. People fell in love in Hitler's court as they fell in love everywhere. The tragedy is not that the emotions were absent, but that they were expressed within and in service of a system so profoundly evil. The preparations for the wedding were elaborate and involved the organizational resources of the Nazi state in ways that reflected the event's political significance. The SS, which maintained its own administrative apparatus for the management of its members' personal affairs, was involved in the formal procedures. Nazi marriage law required that SS members obtain the approval of the Reichsführer SS before marrying, and candidates for marriage to SS men were expected to meet racial and ideological criteria that were assessed by the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. The process was a bureaucratic expression of the SS's obsessive concern with racial purity. Even in marriage, the organization asserted its authority over the personal lives of its members and insisted that the private sphere serve the ideological goals of the state. For Gretel Braun, the racial assessment was presumably a formality. She was a German woman of Bavarian Catholic background, and the Braun family had no Jewish ancestry. But the requirement that the assessment be conducted at all tells us something about the total character of the world these people inhabited. A world in which even the choice of a marriage partner was not purely personal, but was subject to the scrutiny and approval of a bureaucratic machinery dedicated to the enforcement of racial ideology. The Knight's Cross groom and his sporty Bavarian bride had to file paperwork with the Race and Settlement Main Office before they could legally marry. This was the Third Reich. The ceremony itself, as we have noted, was a civil marriage conducted according to Nazi custom. It is worth dwelling on the details of what this meant, because the SS had developed a distinctive approach to marriage rituals that reflected Himmler's eccentric neo-pagan ideology. Himmler believed that Christianity was a corrupting influence on the Germanic people, and that the SS should cultivate alternative spiritual traditions rooted in what he imagined to be ancient Germanic or Nordic practices. He established the Ahnenerbe, an SS research institute dedicated to finding evidence for this imagined Aryan past, and he promoted the use of new SS ceremonies that would replace Christian ones for major life events: birth, marriage, and death. These new ceremonies involved runes, fires, and declarations that replaced Christian vows with pledges of loyalty to the SS and to racial principles. Fegelein and Gretel's civil wedding incorporated some of these elements, though the degree to which any particular ceremony conformed to Himmler's ideological prescriptions varied considerably in practice. What is documented is that the ceremony took place without a priest, in conformity with the SS's explicit rejection of religious authority over its members' personal lives. Hitler's presence at some portion of the festivities transformed what might have been merely a high-status social event into something approaching a state occasion. The guest list for the reception at the Berghof deserves more detailed consideration than we have yet given it. Among those present was Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and soon-to-be-appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer occupies a particularly complex position in the history of the Nazi period because of his post-war attempts to present himself as a technocrat who had been merely doing his professional job without knowing about or approving of the Holocaust. This self-presentation has been thoroughly demolished by subsequent historians, but it gave him a degree of sympathy at the Nuremberg trials that saved him from the gallows. He was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison rather than death. At the Fegelein wedding, however, Speer was still at the height of his power, the most trusted non-political figure in Hitler's personal circle, the man who had redesigned Berlin and planned the ceremonial architecture of the Thousand-Year Reich. Martin Bormann attended the wedding in his capacity as the keeper of Hitler's private world, and his presence was significant in ways that went beyond mere social attendance. Bormann had made himself indispensable to Hitler by controlling access to him with meticulous and ruthless efficiency, screening everyone who wanted to see the Führer, managing his correspondence, and ensuring that information that might disturb Hitler or challenge his preferred view of events was filtered or suppressed. He was deeply disliked by almost everyone else in the inner circle, including Eva Braun, who found him crude and calculating and who resented his attempts to manage her relationship with Hitler. At the wedding, Bormann would have attended primarily because failing to attend would have been politically unwise, given the clear favour Hitler was showing the event. His presence was an acknowledgement of Fegelein's status, not a gesture of genuine friendship. Ribbentrop's attendance at the wedding is another point worth considering. The foreign minister was by 1944 one of the more isolated figures in the inner circle, his star having declined as German foreign policy moved from the diplomatic triumphs of the late 1930s to the military catastrophes of the early 1940s. His relationships with most of his colleagues were poor, and Hitler himself had largely stopped consulting him on major decisions. Yet he still held his title, still commanded a substantial ministry, and still attended the social events that were expected of a senior figure. At the Fegelein wedding, he would have been one of many powerful men performing their social obligations while their political positions were quietly eroding beneath them. The music at the reception is not specifically documented, but we can reconstruct something of what it likely sounded like from the broader context of Nazi social life. Music at Hitler's court tended toward the operatic and the classical, with Wagner holding a place of particular honor, as well as popular dance music of the era. Richard Wagner's music was central to Hitler's personal aesthetic and to the broader cultural program of National Socialism. Its combination of Germanic mythology, emotional intensity, and grandiose scale made it the ideal soundtrack for a regime that conceived of itself in apocalyptic and heroic terms. But evening entertainments at the Berghof also included lighter music, tangos and foxtrots, and the popular songs of the day, because even the Third Reich's most devoted adherents wanted to dance. The photographs from the wedding show a dance floor in use and guests in attitudes of social relaxation. And it is entirely plausible that among the guests at the Fegelein reception, some of the most powerful and dangerous men in Europe were dancing the tango. The food and drink deserve consideration too, as they illuminate the extraordinary gap between the private luxury of the Nazi elite and the public privation of wartime Germany. By June 1944, the German civilian population had been living under rationing for nearly 5 years. Food was short, meat was particularly restricted, and the visible prosperity of the early years of Nazi economic recovery had given way to the grinding shortages of total war. German cities were being bombed with increasing frequency and ferocity. The deaths and casualties on the Eastern Front had touched virtually every family in Germany. And yet, at the Berghof, at the Fegelein wedding, there would have been no shortage of anything. The SS maintained extensive agricultural and catering operations to supply Hitler's headquarters and the Berghof, and the resources available to this private supply chain were far beyond those accessible to ordinary citizens. The champagne would have been real champagne, the food would have been of pre-war quality, and the guests would have eaten and drunk with the appetite of people who had not had to think about rationing for years. One figure who was conspicuously absent from the wedding, or at least not prominently featured in the surviving accounts, was the older Braun's sister, Ilse. Ilse Braun had always maintained a somewhat more reserved relationship with the Nazi inner circle than Eva or Gretel. She had her own life in Munich and was not as fully absorbed into the Berghof world as her sisters. Her absence, if it was indeed an absence, might simply reflect practical considerations of the kind that keep family members from weddings everywhere: distance, competing obligations, the complexities of wartime travel. But it is also possible that Ilse maintained a degree of psychological distance from the world Eva and Gretel had entered, a distance that would serve her well in the post-war period when the Braun name became a burden rather than a mark of distinction. Let us now trace in more detail the trajectory of the Fegelein marriage in its brief 13 months of existence between the wedding of June 1944 and Fegelein's execution in April 1945. The summer and autumn of 1944, as we have noted, were catastrophic for Germany militarily. The Normandy landing was followed by the rapid advance of Allied forces across France, the liberation of Paris in August, and by September 1944, the Allied armies were approaching the German border. On the Eastern Front, Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive launched in June 1944, had shattered Army Group Center and killed or captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. These were defeats on a scale that made the earlier disasters at Stalingrad and Kursk look manageable by comparison. For those in Hitler's headquarters, the daily military briefings became increasingly painful exercises in which Hitler's refusal to accept the reality of the situation collided with the hard military facts that his generals were trying to present. Fegelein's position in these briefings was peculiar. As the SS liaison, he was not a military commander with operational responsibilities, so he was not subject to the same direct confrontations with Hitler over troop dispositions and strategic decisions that were making life unbearable for the Wehrmacht generals. He could observe the daily dramas of Hitler's rages and the generals' humiliations from a slight remove, reporting to Himmler on what he observed but not personally responsible for the military failures that were generating the Führer's explosions of fury. This relative insulation gave him a degree of social survival that the more operationally involved officers lacked. The attempted assassination of July 20th, 1944 changed the atmosphere in the headquarters in ways that had lasting consequences. The bomb, planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, had killed 4 people and injured many more, including Fegelein, who was in the room when it exploded. Hitler's survival intensified his conviction that destiny had preserved him for a special purpose, while simultaneously deepening his already profound paranoia about betrayal. The wave of arrests, torture, and executions that followed the July plot swept up not only the actual conspirators but hundreds of people, with varying degrees of peripheral connection to anti-Nazi circles. Over 5,000 people were ultimately killed in the reprisals following the July plot. Fegelein navigated this dangerous period with the social intelligence that had characterized his entire career. He was demonstrably loyal, present, wounded in the blast, and connected to Himmler, who was now more powerful than ever as a result of being given authority over the investigation of the plot. He was also, through Eva Braun, and thus through the Braun family connection to Hitler, insulated from the suspicion that was poisoning relationships throughout the officer corps. The family connection, which he had worked so deliberately to establish through his marriage, was paying dividends in the most practical possible way. While dozens of officers of similar rank were being arrested, interrogated, and executed, Fegelein moved through the same environment with relative freedom. Gretel's pregnancy, which became apparent in the autumn of 1944, was a source of pleasure within the inner circle. Eva Braun was reportedly delighted, and Hitler, who had a particular fondness for children, expressed his pleasure at the news. The prospect of a child in the extended family represented a kind of normalcy that was increasingly difficult to maintain as the military situation deteriorated. In one of the terrible ironies that seemed to characterize this entire story, the news of the pregnancy arrived at roughly the same time as some of the most devastating military setbacks: the failure of the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944 and January 1945, the Soviet winter offensive of January 1945. That drove deep into Germany itself and the beginning of the final phase of the war, in which everyone in the bunker knew, whatever they might say in front of Hitler, that the end was only a matter of time. It was in this context that Himmler began his extraordinary attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Himmler, who had been the single most powerful figure in implementing the Holocaust, who had personally overseen the creation and management of the concentration camp system, who had organized the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that had murdered over 1 million Jews and others in the East, apparently believed that the Western Allies might be willing to negotiate with him if Germany gave up the war against them in exchange for permission to continue fighting the Soviet Union. This was a spectacular miscalculation on multiple levels, but it reflected the regime's internal logic. Himmler believed that Western anti-communism would outweigh Western revulsion at his crimes. He was wrong. But through the winter of 1944 to 1945 and into early 1945, he pursued these contacts through intermediaries, including the Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, who met with Himmler and reported his proposals to the Western Allies. They were rejected. Fegelein was aware of these negotiations to a degree that remains historically uncertain. As Himmler's liaison at the Führer bunker, he would have been privy to information about Himmler's activities that most other people in the bunker did not have. Whether this knowledge constituted active participation in the negotiations, passive awareness, or something in between is not clear from the surviving documents. What is clear is that when the negotiations became known to Hitler through Allied radio broadcasts in late April 1945, and when Himmler's treachery became undeniable, the connection between Himmler and Fegelein became instantly toxic. Fegelein had been Himmler's man at Hitler's headquarters, and the patron's crime cast a shadow over the protégé, even if the protégé had nothing directly to do with the negotiations. The discovery of Fegelein's disappearance from the bunker came on April 27th or 28th, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting just a few kilometers from the Reich Chancellery. The precise timeline of events in those final days is somewhat confused in the surviving accounts, partly because the witnesses were themselves under extreme stress, and partly because some of the principal witnesses did not survive to give coherent testimony. What is clear is that SS personnel sent to find Fegelein located him at his private apartment in the Charlottenburg district, a comfortable bourgeois flat in a part of Berlin that was not yet under direct Soviet attack. He was in civilian clothes, substantially intoxicated, and a woman was present. Documents found in the apartment suggested that he had been in contact with the outside world in ways that he had not disclosed to the bunker. The identity of the woman with him has been a subject of historical speculation. Some accounts identify her as a Hungarian woman connected to diplomatic circles. Others suggest she may have been a woman with connections to neutral countries who could have facilitated an escape route. The documents found in the apartment are variously described as including money, false papers and communications that suggested Fegelein had been preparing to flee Berlin and possibly Germany. The picture that emerges is of a man who had been running a secret contingency plan for his own escape while continuing to attend briefings in the bunker, a double life that was entirely in keeping with his character, but which, when discovered in the context of the bunker's final days and the revelation of Himmler's treachery, looked like a conspiracy. He was brought back to the bunker under armed escort. Eva Braun made her intercession, appealing to Hitler on the grounds of family loyalty and Gretel's pregnancy. Those present later described the intercession as brave given the atmosphere in the bunker, but ultimately unsuccessful. Hitler had entered a phase in which sentimentality, however genuine the emotion behind it, was being overridden by the manic insistence that traitors must be punished. He was planning his own suicide, was about to marry Eva Braun, and was simultaneously issuing orders for the execution of the man who had danced at his companion's sister's wedding less than a year before. The emotional range on display in that bunker in those final days defies easy psychological description. The court-martial was brief and its outcome predetermined. Fegelein had no meaningful defense. He had been absent without authorization. Documents suggesting preparation for escape had been found in his apartment. He had been Himmler's liaison, and Himmler was now a declared traitor. Whether he had actually done anything that rose to the level of treason in any technical sense was ultimately irrelevant, because in the bunker in April 1945, the distinction between technical legal standards and the Führer's will had ceased to exist. The verdict was death. The formality of stripping him of his rank and decorations was observed, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves removed from his uniform, and he was taken to the Reich Chancellery garden. Several accounts of the execution describe him as still partially drunk, perhaps unable to walk steadily, perhaps barely comprehending what was happening. Other accounts suggest he died with more composure. The truth is probably impossible to establish with certainty at this distance. What is certain is that on April 29, 1945, one day before Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives, Hermann Fegelein was shot by an SS firing squad in a garden in Berlin. He was 38 years old. He had known Hitler for less than 18 months. He had been married for less than a year. His child had not yet been born. Among the interesting secondary questions raised by the Fegelein, execution is what Eva Braun thought and felt in the hours and days that followed. She had interceded for his life and failed. She had known him as her brother-in-law, found him charming and amusing, and had clearly hoped that his connection to her and her sister would protect him. Instead, it had not been enough. She was herself in the final hours of her life, having decided to die with Hitler, and yet the execution of Fegelein was not the only emotional blow she absorbed in those last days. She had also learned that Himmler, one of the most powerful figures in the regime, and a man she had known for years through Hitler's court, had betrayed the cause. The world she had organized her life around was dissolving in real time, and the people who had filled it were dying, betraying or fleeing. She died on April 30th, 1945, having married Hitler in a brief ceremony in the bunker late the previous night. The marriage ceremony, which took place at around 1 a.m. on April 29th, 1945, just hours after Fegelein's execution, was conducted by a civil registrar named Walter Wagner, who had been located through considerable effort in the besieged city. The ceremony was brief, the atmosphere surreal. Hitler and Eva in their wedding clothes in the bunker's map room, surrounded by a handful of witnesses, including Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels, while Soviet artillery fire shook the walls above them. Eva Braun signed the marriage register and became Eva Hitler, the only occasion on which she would use the name, and then died roughly 18 hours later. She was 33 years old. The full circle of the story, connecting the two weddings, the lavish June ceremony in the Bavarian mountains and the desperate midnight ceremony in the Berlin bunker, with Fegelein's execution falling between them, constitutes one of the most compressed dramatic narratives in modern history. In less than a year, the axis of personal loyalty and family connection that had been celebrated with champagne and mountain flowers had been shattered entirely. The groom was dead, shot by the regime he had served. The bride was a pregnant widow in Bavaria. The host was dead by his own hand. The witness who had photographed the June wedding so joyfully had herself become a bride and then a corpse within the same 24-hour period. The entire social world of the Berghof had collapsed with a completeness and a speed that even the most pessimistic observer in June 1944 could not have predicted. In the weeks and months after Germany's surrender, the full scope of what the Nazi regime had done began to emerge into public consciousness. The liberation of the concentration camps by Allied forces in April and May 1945, the discoveries at Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and dozens of other sites of mass murder confronted the world with evidence that exceeded in its horror almost everything that had been imagined or reported during the war itself. For those in Germany, particularly those who had been part of the Nazi elite or had lived adjacent to it, this moment of revelation required an accounting that most were not prepared to give honestly. The denazification process that the Allied powers implemented in occupied Germany was an attempt to address this problem systematically. Courts were established across the 4 occupation zones to classify former Nazis into 5 categories, ranging from major offenders to nominal members, with punishments ranging from imprisonment and confiscation of property to mere payment of reparations. The process was enormous in scale, ultimately touching millions of people, and it was also deeply imperfect. The classification decisions were inconsistent, influenced by local politics and the capacity of individual defendants to present favourable evidence about their wartime conduct. Many genuine war criminals received lenient classifications, while some marginal participants were treated harshly. The process satisfied no one fully. Survivors and victims found it inadequate. Former Nazis found it unjust, and historians looking back find it a fascinating but deeply flawed attempt to impose legal order on a moral catastrophe of incomprehensible scale. For Gretel Fegelein, the denazification process was a significant ordeal. She had been part of the Nazi inner circle, had lived at the Berghof, had been married to an SS general who had committed war crimes. She was not simply a bystander. She had been present at events, had known the people, had enjoyed the privileges. At the same time, she had not been a decision-maker, had not issued orders, had not participated in the administrative machinery of murder. She was a young woman who had married into a world she had been raised to find glamorous and powerful, had borne its child, and now had to account for herself to Allied courts while simultaneously grieving for a dead sister, a dead husband, and a destroyed world. The practical circumstances of her immediate post-war life were difficult. She had a newborn baby, Eva Barbara, born in the first days of May 1945, and she was in Bavaria with whatever resources she had been able to accumulate or preserve. The Braun family home in Munich was still standing, and she had her parents and surviving family around her, but the atmosphere of occupied Germany in 1945 was one of physical destruction, shortages of food and fuel and housing, and the constant presence of Allied forces conducting investigations and making arrests. The glamour and privilege of the Berghof years were entirely gone, replaced by the grinding difficulty of ordinary life in a defeated country. Little Eva Barbara Fegelein was growing up in this environment, surrounded by a family that had to navigate the complex demands of a society simultaneously trying to rebuild and trying to reckon with its past. The specific circumstances of her birth, the posthumous child of an executed SS general, the niece of Hitler's wife born, into a Germany that was just beginning to discover the full horror of what its recent leaders had done, would have been impossible to explain to a child in any simple way. The strategy that Gretel and other members of the family apparently adopted was the one that was most common in that generation. Silence. The past was not discussed, the name of Fegelein was not invoked, the Braun connection was not emphasized. Eva Barbara grew up with the knowledge of who her parents had been, but without a family culture of open engagement with that knowledge. This pattern of silence was characteristic of the post-war German experience more broadly. The sociologist Alexander and Margaret Mitscherlich wrote in their influential 1967 work The Inability to Mourn about what they saw as the German population's collective failure to engage honestly with its Nazi past, its preference for economic reconstruction and forward-looking national identity over the painful work of genuine reckoning. This observation has been refined and complicated by subsequent historical work, but it captures something real about the dominant mood of the 1950s and early 1960s in West Germany. People who had been active participants in or willing supporters of the Nazi regime, or who had lived adjacent to it, as Gretel Fegelein had, found in the general social consensus that the past should be put behind them, an invitation to avoid personal accounting that many accepted gratefully. The gradual shift in German public culture toward more honest engagement with the Nazi past began in the late 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s, driven partly by the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, partly by the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, and partly by generational change as the children and grandchildren of the wartime generation asked questions that their elders had been avoiding. By the 1970s and 1980s, the social pressure toward honest reckoning had become powerful enough that silence was no longer a viable public strategy. Figures like Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who governed occupied Poland, were publicly denouncing their fathers and demanding that Germany look at what it had done. The question for people like Gretel Fegelein and Eva Barbara was how to respond to this shift. Their response, as best we can determine from the limited public record, was continued privacy rather than public engagement. Neither Gretel nor Eva Barbara became public figures in the way that some children of Nazi leaders did. They did not write books, give interviews, or participate in the memorial culture that developed around the Nazi period. This choice is neither obviously right nor obviously wrong. The decision about how to engage with an inherited identity of this kind, whether and how to speak publicly about a past that is not of your own making, but that defines how the world sees you, is a deeply personal one, and there is no correct answer that applies to everyone. What is clear is that both women chose private lives, and that those private lives were shaped throughout by the extraordinary circumstances of that brief period in 1944 and 1945. The Berghof itself, as we have noted, was deliberately destroyed. But the memory of the place persists in the historical record and in the photographs that Eva Braun took there. These images are now held in archives, and they have been used extensively by historians and documentary filmmakers as visual evidence of the private life of the Nazi leadership. The photographs of the Fegelein wedding, which are among the most vivid social documents of the period, show a world that has utterly ceased to exist, a world of alpine grandeur and social performance and carefully maintained surfaces, a world built on a foundation of crimes that the photographs themselves do not show and could not show. Looking at them now, and knowing everything we know, produces a particular kind of historical vertigo. There is one aspect of the Fegelein story that has received relatively little attention in most historical accounts, but that deserves consideration here: the question of Fegelein's genuine relationships, to the extent that we can reconstruct them. We have discussed his marriage to Gretel as a calculated move, and this is clearly part of the truth. But the marriage also produced a child, and children are produced by intimate human relationships, however politically calculated the context may have been. The question of whether Fegelein loved Gretel in any genuine sense, whether their marriage contained real affection alongside the political calculation, is one that the historical record cannot definitively answer. What we have are the photographs of the wedding, which show the couple in close and apparently affectionate proximity. We have accounts from those present at Berghof events that describe the couple as socially engaged and outwardly happy. We have the fact that Gretel, after the war, did not publicly express bitterness toward Fegelein in the ways that might have been expected of a widow who had been abandoned and widowed in such difficult circumstances. And we have the name she gave her daughter, Ava Barbara. The Ava, clearly, is in honour of her dead sister. But the Barbara? One possibility is that it was simply a name Gretel liked. Another is that it had some significance in terms of the family connection or personal meaning. What we do know is that the child bearing both these names carried within her name the memory of the two most important relationships in her mother's life: the dead sister and the dead husband. It is a naming that speaks to grief rather than bitterness, to memory rather than condemnation. Whatever else Gretel Fegelein felt about the man she had married, she did not entirely refuse him in the act of naming his child. The question of Fegelein's wider significance in the history of the Waffen-SS and the Nazi regime leads us into broader territory. He was, in many ways, a representative figure of a particular type within the SS. The cavalryman turned courtier, the man who could move between the brutal practicalities of mass murder operations in the East and the civilized performance of the Berghof reception table without apparently experiencing cognitive dissonance. This type was more common in the Nazi leadership than is sometimes acknowledged. The SS particularly bred it, because the SS combined a genuine military culture, with real campaigns and real casualties and real decorations, with an ideological commitment to racial murder that was expressed in the most brutal possible terms. Men who could inhabit both of these worlds, who could be competent soldiers and efficient killers and agreeable dinner companions simultaneously, were exactly what the SS needed and exactly what it produced. The parallel with figures discussed in our other video on German generals after World War II is instructive. Men like Albert Kesselring, who served as the commander of German forces in Italy and was responsible for ordering the Ardeatine Cave massacre of 335 Italian civilian hostages, were similarly able to compartmentalize their roles as military commanders and as participants in war crimes. Kesselring was known as Smiling Albert for his pleasant disposition, a nickname that speaks to exactly the same quality that Fegelein demonstrated: the ability to maintain a social surface of warmth and good humour, while directing or participating in acts of extreme violence. The pleasantness was real, not a cynical performance, and that is precisely what makes it so disturbing. The Fegelein wedding can be understood, in this broader context, as a ritual expression of the kind of social order the Nazi regime was trying to create: hierarchical, racially defined, militarized, and yet also capable of producing occasions of genuine human joy and beauty. The Third Reich was not simply or purely a machine of murder, though it was certainly that. It was, also for those inside its protected circles, a functioning social order with its own aesthetic standards, its own celebrations, its own loves and loyalties. The tragedy is not that these things existed, but that they coexisted with the murder so seamlessly that the same people who celebrated at the Fegelein wedding were organising or implementing the systematic killing that was continuing on every front while the reception toasts were being made. As the late historian Saul Friedländer argued throughout his monumental history of the Nazi period, the challenge for historians is to maintain what he called an integrated history, one that holds the perspective of the perpetrators and the perspective of the victims simultaneously, that does not allow the familiar and human qualities of the perpetrators to crowd out the suffering of those they targeted, but that also does not reduce the history to simple moral categories that allow readers to place themselves comfortably outside the story. The Fegelein wedding is a perfect test case for this integrated approach. It was a real wedding at which real people experienced real joy. It was embedded in a regime that was committing real mass murder. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. The post-war fate of the SS as an institution illuminates something about what the wedding meant and what the people who attended it had been part of. As the source material gathered for this video shows, the Waffen-SS was declared a criminal organization at the Nuremberg trials in September 1946, meaning that membership in it could itself constitute a crime, though with exceptions for those conscripted after 1943, or those who could prove they had avoided ideological involvement. For former SS men, the denazification process produced wildly varying outcomes, from imprisonment for the most notorious offenders to simple bureaucratic classification and release for the vast majority of lower-ranking members. The veterans' organization HIAG, founded in 1951 by former SS generals, including Paul Hauser and Felix Steiner, worked for decades to rehabilitate the reputation of the Waffen-SS, arguing that its members had been soldiers like any other rather than criminals. This argument was ultimately unsuccessful historically, but it had real political traction in West Germany during the 1950s and 1960s, when the need to reintegrate hundreds of thousands of former SS men into civilian life created political pressures that often overwhelmed moral clarity. For Hermann Fegelein's specific wartime record, the history is unambiguous. The operations in the Pripyat marshes in 1941, for which he received his Knight's Cross, constituted mass murder of Jewish civilians. The 8th SS Cavalry Division's operations throughout the Eastern Front involved systematic brutality against civilian populations. These facts are documented in his own reports and in the broader historical record of Waffen-SS operations. That he was never tried for war crimes was purely a function of his 1945 execution, which preceded the Nuremberg process. Had he survived the war, he would almost certainly have faced prosecution, and the evidence against him was of the kind that had produced death sentences and lengthy prison terms for other SS commanders. In the end, the Fegelein wedding is a story about the coexistence of the human and the monstrous, about the way in which ordinary social rituals, love, marriage, family, celebration, were incorporated into the Nazi world without losing their ordinary human character, but also without being purified of the moral weight of the context in which they occurred. Every glass of champagne raised at that reception was raised in a world where tens of millions of people were suffering because of the regime that the guests served. Every photograph that Eva Braun took of her happy sister and her decorated brother-in-law was taken by a woman who was herself one of the most emblematic. Victims of the same regime, a woman kept hidden, denied public acknowledgement, and ultimately chosen for death over survival. The story of the Fegelein wedding is, at its deepest level, a story about the nature of complicity. Not the dramatic, active complicity of those who planned and ordered mass murder, but the quieter, more ordinary complicity of those who accepted the world they were given, enjoyed its pleasures, ignored its costs, and participated in its rituals without asking the questions that would have made those rituals impossible. Gretel Braun was not a monster. She was a young Bavarian woman who fell in love with a decorated cavalry officer in the most glamorous and privileged setting imaginable. She married him, celebrated her wedding, had his child, and found herself the widow of a war criminal before her baby was a week old. The distance between the wedding photograph and the reality of what surrounded it is the distance that the entire Nazi enterprise depended upon. Maintaining the gap between surface and substance, between performance and truth, between the fairy tale and the nightmare. It is a distance that history insists we close. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video not only informative, but genuinely thought-provoking. The Fegelein wedding is one of those stories that seems on the surface like a colourful footnote to the grand narrative of World War II, but which, looked at closely, opens up into something much larger and more disturbing about the nature of the world that produced it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the private life of the Nazi inner circle, make sure to check out our other videos, including What Happened to the Wives of Nazi Leaders After World War II, what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, and what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II. Each of these videos continues the story of how the world of the Third Reich fell apart and what happened to the people who had built it and lived inside it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. There is another dimension to the Fegelein wedding that we have not yet fully explored. The ways in which it intersected with the broader cultural project of National Socialism, specifically with the regime's obsessive concern with visual self-presentation and the production of what we might call ideological imagery. The Nazi regime was, among other things, a regime of images. It understood the power of visual spectacle from its earliest days, and the carefully managed photography and film that documented the Berghof, the Nuremberg rallies, the military parades, and the private social life of the elite was always serving multiple purposes simultaneously. It was documentary, yes, but it was also performative, constructing a visual narrative of German strength, beauty and racial destiny that the regime wished to project both domestically and internationally. Eva Braun's photography of the Fegelein wedding was, in this sense, part of a long tradition of image-making at the Berghof that she had been conducting for years. She photographed Hitler constantly, capturing him in the domestic and relaxed settings that his official photographers rarely depicted, reading newspapers, playing with his dog Blondie, chatting with guests, enjoying his retreat. These images served a function for Eva herself, as personal mementos of a life that she could not publicly acknowledge, but they also accumulated over the years into an extraordinary visual archive of the most powerful man in the world in his most private moments. When she photographed the Fegelein wedding, she was adding to this archive a new layer: the family celebration, the sisters' happiness, the social world of the inner circle at play. The photographs are now housed in the US National Archives and in various other repositories, having been seized by Allied forces after the war as part of the enormous documentation sweep that accompanied the occupation of Germany. They have been reproduced in countless histories and documentaries, and their ability to surprise continues to be noted by people encountering them for the first time. There is something deeply disorienting about seeing Hitler at a garden party, Hitler chatting with Eva Braun on a mountain terrace, Hitler apparently at ease and cheerful in the company of people who are also apparently at ease and cheerful. The photographs refuse to show us the monster, because in those moments he was not displaying the qualities that made him monstrous, and because the camera records surfaces, not depths. The Fegelein wedding photographs share this disorienting quality. They show a wedding. They show joy, celebration, the social rituals that human beings have always used to mark important transitions. They do not show what we know about the people in them, and they cannot. The gap between the surface of the images and the depth of the historical knowledge we bring to them is precisely the gap that the Nazi regime exploited, and that historical work must continuously work to close. Understanding the Fegelein story also requires us to consider what happened to others who were part of the same social world. We have discussed the major figures: Himmler, Bormann, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Göring. But there were many others who moved through the Berghof world and who had less prominent roles in the historical record, but whose stories are equally revealing. The adjutants who arranged the wedding, the secretaries who typed the invitations, the household staff who prepared the food and flowers, the soldiers who provided security for the event. All of these people were part of the machinery that made the Fegelein wedding possible, and their subsequent fates ranged from prosecution to quiet reintegration. Into post-war German society, the women who worked as Hitler's secretaries and personal staff, Traudl Junge, Christa Schröder and others, wrote memoirs in later years that provide invaluable glimpses of the private world at the Berghof and in the bunker. Traudl Junge, who was present in the bunker through the final days and typed Hitler's last will and testament, lived with the weight of her proximity to evil for the rest of her life. Her memoir, published shortly before her death in 2002, is one of the most important first-hand accounts of what it was actually like to inhabit that world, and it shows both the ordinariness of daily life there and the absolute horror of what that ordinariness was embedded in. The broader question of women's roles in the Nazi regime has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades, with historians arguing that the traditional picture of women as passive bystanders or unwilling victims of Nazi ideology significantly understates their active participation in the system. The wives of SS officers, the female guards at concentration camps, the women who participated in the economic plunder of Jewish property, the teachers who implemented Nazi racial ideology in classrooms, all of these represent different forms of female complicity that the earlier historiography tended to minimize. The women of the Berghof social world, including Gretel Fegelein, occupied a specific niche in this larger picture. They were not policymakers or administrators. They were social participants whose presence at the heart of the regime's power, whose acceptance of its privileges and their insulation from its costs, constituted a form of complicity that did not require them to sign any orders or carry any weapons. The question of moral responsibility in the absence of direct action is one of the most difficult that the history of the Nazi period raises. At what point does acceptance of privilege within an unjust system become culpable? When does proximity to evil without direct participation constitute a form of moral failure? These are questions that the Fegelein wedding raises in concentrated form, and they are questions that do not have simple answers. What the story does is refuse us the comfort of simple categories. The victims on one side, the perpetrators on the other, and everyone else safely in the middle as passive observers. The Fegelein wedding shows us that social life under the Nazi regime, the actual daily experience of people in its inner circle, was far more complicated and morally entangled than the simple categories allow. Hermann Fegelein himself, with his combination of genuine military courage, social charm, calculated ambition, and participation in mass murder, is a figure who defies the simple categories from a different direction. He was not a bureaucrat of murder like Eichmann, organizing the logistics of genocide from behind a desk. He was a combat soldier who also directed massacres, a decorated hero who was also a war criminal, a charming social animal who was also an opportunist without moral scruple. His life and death, from the riding school in Ansbach to the execution in the Reich Chancellery Garden, traces a parabola that tells us something important about how the Nazi system worked, how it created the conditions for people like him to rise, and how it ultimately consumed them. The legacy of the Fegelein wedding extends, in its own small way, into the present. Eva Barbara Fegelein, if she is still alive, would be in her early 80s, a woman who has spent her entire life with a particular and unusual inheritance. The public record of her life is largely absent, which suggests that she has maintained the privacy that her mother established. But the historical record, the documents and photographs and testimony that constitute our knowledge of what happened in June 1944 and April 1945 is permanent and publicly available. It does not forget, and it cannot be erased. The Fairytale wedding and the nightmare execution exist together in the archive, inseparable parts of the same story. That story belongs to the broader history of a regime that lasted 12 years and killed tens of millions of people, that transformed Europe and scarred the 20th century, and continues to shape our understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. The Fegelein wedding is a small story within that larger one, a personal drama within a historical catastrophe. But small stories told carefully are how we understand large ones, and the personal drama of Hermann and Gretel Fegelein, of Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler, of the champagne and the flowers and the photographs and the execution and the orphan child is as illuminating in its way as any grand strategic analysis. It shows us the human face of the catastrophe, which is the most important and the most disturbing face to look at. We hope this journey through the story of the Fegelein wedding has given you a deeper understanding not only of this specific event, but of the world that produced it and was destroyed by it. The past is never simply the past. It lives in the archives, in the photographs, in the families, and in the ongoing work of trying to understand how the world came to be what it is. Thank you for being part of that work. See you in the next one.